Mixed race people are our fastest growing minority group. And I can't help noticing that they're having a massive impact on our society. They're coming to dominate music, modeling, and sport. In England, where mixed race people currently make up less than 2% of the population, they make up 30% of the national football team. And it's not just here. The leader of the free world is the child of a black Kenyan man and a white woman from the plains of Kansas. Many mixed race people seem to be so gifted. Is this just a fashion, or is something deeper going on? I'm Aarathi Prasad. I'm a geneticist, and I want to explore an incredible idea. A controversial new theory suggesting mixed race people might have a biological advantage. Could there be something happening at the level of their genes that makes them so special? Is it better to be mixed race? Meet Tara, my daughter. I'm of Indian descent, and her dad, Robin, is white English. So Tara is mixed race. What do you think you are? How do you describe yourself?
Indian and English.
Indian and English?
Yeah.
Do you like having two different backgrounds?
Yes, sir.
I was doing my PhD in molecular genetics when Tara was born, and I was intrigued by what her genetic inheritance might be.
But look, I've got dark brown arms, but it's
And what colour is the hair on your arms?
black, some blonde.
Some blonde and some black. I don't have any blonde. But of course, being mixed race has great social implications too. Just a few years ago, Tara would have been called a half-breed or a half-caste. They'd have said she had a touch of the tar brush. If I'd had her before 1967 in the American South, I could have been put in prison. Marriage between black and white was banned in 16 states. Here, to be mixed race has always been seen as a problem. To not fit in and be the butt of jokes. In the sitcom Porridge, being mixed race was the root cause of all the troubles afflicting this character.
Never knew my father. Ma that didn't want me, flaming orphanage, and I'm black with a Scottish accent. Would you want me to be Fletcher? Happy go bloody lucky.
Well, it could be worse, son, couldn't it?
Could it?
No, I don't suppose it could, really.
To some, being mixed race is even worse, an assault on the natural order, an opinion they want everyone to hear.
I think miscegenation is wrong.
Can you explain to me what that word means? Because I don't know.
The interbreeding of Negroes and white people. Because at the end of the day, the product of that, the child, is nothing. It's too white to be black, and it's too black to be white.
BNP leader Nick Griffin once called interracial mixing destructive and unnatural and declared we must preserve the white race. But now there's a controversial new idea that's not going to please the BNP one little bit. It's a theory outlined in a book called Breeding Between the Lines by science writer Alan Zeev. It claims that mixed race people are born with a biological advantage, the result of their greater genetic diversity. In plants and animals, when two very genetically different parents mate, their offspring can be much larger, fitter, and more robust than either of them. All gardeners and farmers know about this. They call it hybrid vigor. But I wonder if it could ever apply to humans. It's not a question that science has dared to confront. I could only find one paper from 1967 that even tried. But I've managed to track down one scientist who's prepared to take the idea seriously. I've come to Cambridge University's zoology department to meet a world expert on the fitness of marine mammals. Geneticist Professor Bill Amos.
There's huge amounts of data from animal systems where you get crosses between slightly different populations, that you get this hybrid vigor. It's got a name. It's completely accepted. Darwin knew about it. All animal breeders know about it.
So mixing genes
Mixing genes is almost invariably good. The sorts of things that we've been finding in animals are that almost every aspect of what you might call being a good quality individual are affected. So, for example, male seals with highest levels of genetic variability arrive earlier in the breeding season. They stay for longer. They're more competitive. They're more attractive. They grow faster. They live longer. They get lower disease. And they hold bigger territories.
So how is mixing genes helping these seals? Like every animal, a seal will inherit one copy of each gene from its parents. If those genes are the same, they are homozygous. But if they are different, the offspring will be heterozygous for that gene, and that can be very handy.
If you think of a toolkit, if you had a spanner, for example, if you had one spanner that perfectly fitted a nut, that would be a good way of solving a problem. But if you have two different spanners, it means you can cope with different scenarios. And the same holds true in genes. If you've got a gene that fights bacteria, if you've got two slightly different versions of that gene, maybe you can fight two different types of bacteria, in which case you might be more resistant to a wider variety of diseases.
But it turns out Professor Amos hasn't just been finding the benefits of genetic diversity in seals. He's been finding it in humans too.
We are starting to find more and more evidence that whatever the infectious disease, that heterozygosity is beneficial in resisting infection. I've been involved with a study in Kenya, for example, where they've looked at children who die in the childhood from bacterial infections. And we found evidence of a strong benefit to being heterozygous. And in fact, we can predict as many as 50% of the children who are likely to die before the age of 5 from a bacterial infection. So that's an astonishing level of predictability in the system.
So heterozygosity is good. And the key to that is to have parents who are genetically as different as possible. Does that mean it would help to have parents from different races?
It strikes me as a very small step to say that in terms of mixed race populations, mixed race individuals, I would certainly expect those individuals to have higher tolerance of disease, be better at fighting disease than, for example, people who come from a much more isolated population.
So I'm thinking my daughter with her Anglo-Saxon father and Indian subcontinent mother might just be better off than either of her
she might well
inbred
be.
parents.
This is certainly a possibility. The question is, could one conduct ethically sound and appropriate experiments and be able to discuss this and get funding to do the studies in practice? My suspicion is that there are enough taboos about this area such that one would be a little nervous about trying to do this.
And it's not hard to see why. Because if I'm going to get any further in my journey, I'm going to have to ask a tricky question. Is there enough genetic difference between the races to give a mixed race child an advantage? And that's a very taboo. I'm trying to find out if there might be a genetic advantage in being mixed race. But to do that, I'm going to have to untangle the science from the taboo. I'm going to have to tread carefully here because it's an idea that certainly ruffled some feathers. This is a white supremacist website, and this is what they think, that not only are mixed people not healthier than purebred people, they're actually unhealthier than racially pure people. And they talk about the theory here, culturally subversive, filthy tripe, not worthy to be used for toilet paper. But they're also not very keen at the opposite end of the political divide. Here's a mixed race website, it's called Intermix. The idea that mixing races is good, they say, are sensationalist. It serves no purpose to pursue such thinking, except to make others feel that they're inadequate for not being mixed. Every end of the political and religious spectrum, whether you're liberal or whether you're far right, nobody really seems to like this idea very much. I want to find out why some mixed-race people seem to be so against the idea. I'm off to meet the author of one of those articles, Sharon Hall, to find out more about her experience.
I don't want young mixed-race people to go through some of the things that I've gone through. We lived in a predominantly white area. There was no one else that looked like me, and I regularly, I got bullied, and when I was 12 we moved to a predominantly black area, and I thought, oh, everything's going to be all right now, you know, because maybe these people will be more understanding. But it wasn't. I'd get my black friends saying to me, oh, you know, you've got to be more black, and my white friends, you know, pulling me the other way. It makes you feel like you don't really belong.
So would it help to find out if mixed-race people might have a genetic advantage?
I think if race is a social construct, which it is, I don't think it's for scientists to look at it. I think that maybe social scientists can look at it, because we can see the impact and racism and look at ways how we can change the way society is put together.
But we shouldn't try to study the difference in our genes.
No, I don't think so. I'm not comfortable with it, and I think a lot of people would be uncomfortable with it. Why does somebody want to know if one race is better than another? It can really get out of control, and I think we as a society need to think about that.
I do understand why Sharon feels this strongly. After all, when it comes to race, science has a lot to answer for. This is the Galton Genetics Laboratory at University College London, once called the Galton Laboratory for National Eugenics. Pioneered by Sir Francis Galton in the early 20th century, eugenics was a science that aimed to improve society by weeding out the genetically inferior.
Eugenics seeks to apply the known laws of heredity so as to prevent the degeneration of the race and improve its inborn qualities.
Eugenics fueled the concept of white racial supremacy, which led inexorably to the final solution. It's often forgotten that the Nazis used science to support their pursuit of an Aryan master race. Back in 1937, in a chilling taste of things to come, Hitler ordered the sterilization of 400 mixed-race children, the offspring of German women and occupying French Senegalese soldiers. Children known locally as the Rhineland Bastards.
Was wir uns unter der deutschen Jugend der Zukunft wünschen, ist etwas anderes. Wir müssen einen neuen Menschen, auf das unser Volk nicht an den typischen Degenerationserscheinungen dieser neuen Zeit runter geht.
Today, Galton's very different lab is run by Professor Steve Jones. I've come to ask him if all this history means that we shouldn't ever again look at the genetics of racial difference.
It's absolutely clear that the belief in racial superiority based on genes, as we'd say today, led directly to the horrors of the extermination programs of the Second World War. So our history is a very, very murky one. But I don't think that necessarily reflects on the present.
When you look at race, when you do research into race, you're inherently looking at differences between people, and that might infer inferiority or superiority.
Well, I think, you know, science deals with facts. It doesn't deal with whether the facts are dangerous or not. And if what you find is uncomfortable or worrying or embarrassing, my response is tough. Okay, that's your problem. Science's job is to uncover facts. Your view of race is a political and social view. You're not going to cure any racist by talking to them about DNA. You can tell them the facts, and then they're going to make up their own political agenda. And so my conscience is completely clear about studying human genetics, about studying the difference between Africans and Europeans. It's part of science.
I can understand why people like Sharon are nervous, but as a scientist, I really agree with Steve. We shouldn't let fear stop us pursuing knowledge.
This brings me back to the main question I have. Back in Cambridge, Bill Amos told me that it is better for us to be heterozygous, that it's better for us to have genetic diversity. But for racial mixing to increase this genetic diversity, then that means that racial differences need to exist. Races need to exist. But that's an idea that's become almost taboo in modern science. It's something people just don't like to talk about.
We can all see that people from different parts of the world look different. But is this variation any more than just skin deep? Way in the past, it was simple. To the Victorians, there were 5 main races, which they ordered in a hierarchy, with the white Northern Europeans always at the top. Then, at the turn of this century, we mapped the human genome. It turns out we are a very young species, with only a tiny amount of genetic diversity. Between any 2 humans, the average difference is only 1/10 of 1%. So where does that leave the concept of race now? I've come to Edinburgh to meet population geneticist Dr. Jim Wilson. He knows all the latest on the genetics of race, or populations, as he prefers to call them.
I mean, I think the old idea of race is a notion that's very, very difficult. It was an absolute notion, wherein people were absolutely different, whether they were black or white, and that is invalid. But speaking about it from the genetic side, there are differences. There are rather large differences among human populations.
To understand how those differences occurred, you have to go back to where our ancestors evolved.
We all originated in Africa really rather recently, about 70,000 years ago. The first modern humans left Africa. So we originated somewhere around about the Rift Valley here in East Africa. And I would say probably a maximum of 100 people left and crossed southern Arabia and came along the coast, moving really rather quickly. Took only about 2,000 years to reach all the way to Australia and to New Guinea. And then later, groups started to move inland and populate the interior. These populations would have evolved in each place, and so they developed their own suite of genetic variants. And there was a considerable gap before people began to migrate towards Europe, only about 40,000 years ago. So what happens is, if we look at it today, we can separate people out on the basis of their genes. For instance, East Asia in this sort of an area, South Asia, and what I call Western Eurasia here. And you can actually see this change in the different DNA types across these regions.
When Jim was drawing circles on the map of the world, it looked a lot to me like the old-fashioned ideas of races. But it's not as rigid as the Victorians believed. There isn't a huge difference between us. The difference is very small, and it's more of a continuum, but the differences do exist.
Scientists are often finding new genes that are more prevalent in some populations than others. They also find that some disease genes are more common in populations that are genetically separated.
The main cause is geographical isolation, and that's why there's so many islands which have very small gene pools. But there's also social reasons. Religious and traditional practices can also really restrict genetic diversity. If you look at the Samaritans from the Middle East, for example, they prefer to marry their cousins or within their faith. Some of the British Pakistani community also have this tradition of first cousin marriages, and that may well be linked to the high level of genetic defects that they're suffering.
In North London, the Ashkenazi Jewish community are tackling one specific disease called Tay Sachs. It's caused by a gene which is 10 times more prevalent in their population. Here, Dr. Philip Koch is trying to eradicate the disease with a screening program. He knows better than most how devastating it can be to have a Tay Sachs child.
Tay Sachs disease is a recessive genetic disease that affects infants. Infants born with this defect have a life expectancy of only approximately 3 years. There is no cure, there is no treatment, and it's overwhelmingly distressing, as I can tell you, because I've had 2 children myself. I fathered 2 Tay Sachs children.
The disease only shows itself if the child inherits identical copies from both parents. This is homozygosity, and it's been made much more likely over the years by the Jewish cultural practice of only marrying other Jews.
It's interesting because for other communities, inbreeding is not something they really admit. But the Tay Sachs as exists in Ashkenazi communities, you would say it might be because of inbreeding?
Yes, I would say, and I'm sure my peers would say the same, that hasn't helped at all.
From the Tay Sachs point of view then, if you put tradition and religion aside and just look kind of scientifically, objectively, do you have a sense that mixed race people could be better off in terms of their health and having a lessened burden of diseases that were typical for their own communities?
Yes, of course. It would be, from a genetic point of view, a far better situation if you didn't confine yourself to the same particular genetic order. Yes, without question, but there are other factors involved.
Of course.
And it's not just Tay Sachs and the Jews. It can happen in bigger populations too.
I'll tell you what I'm likely to get, because under diabetes there's South Asians, and coronary heart disease, the only race in that group, high risk, are South Asians. To me this is reality. I see this in my own family. My mum, my dad, all my grandparents, all my aunties and uncles, and there are 11 of them in India, have this kind of diabetes, a lot of them have heart disease. My aunt and her husband are now on their deathbeds in India with heart disease. And my dad died when he was 57 years old, 57 of coronary heart disease. To me, I'm looking at a list here and I'm seeing that these are diseases that me, as someone of Indian descent, is very likely to get. Well, what's striking is when you go down the list and you look at dementia, for example, the only group that's high risk for dementia are Europeans. Skin cancer, again, Europeans. For multiple sclerosis, Europeans. It's very, very clear-cut. I mean, it's not that they are not the only people who get it, but they get it the worst.
This European disease load seems surprising. After all, it's such a large continent. I'd have expected a large gene pool.
We can actually see that lots of people who wouldn't ordinarily consider themselves to be inbred, just urban Europeans for instance, are actually rather inbred because they share a lot of ancestors. It wasn't all that long ago that there were only 1 million people living in Europe, so you only have to go back 20 or 30 or perhaps 40 generations and everyone in Europe is related, and everyone in Europe's parents are therefore related, which means everyone in Europe is inbred. Not inbred in the sense that the offspring of first cousins is inbred, but inbred nevertheless. There's a continuum, and we all lie on that continuum.
It's looking like racial purity can be really bad for your health.
And this idea of purity, it comes from a fallacy, actually, of superiority of the North European people, when in fact, if we looked at this biologically, it's much, much better not to be purebred in that way, and you'd rather be mixed so that you decreased your chances of recessive genes having their effect.
But if they're inbred, what happens when you outbreed?
Well, I would predict if you took, for instance, a European, someone from here, and they mated with someone from East Asia, that you would have a lot more diversity in that person. They'd be very, very heterozygous, so the variants, the genetic variants they'd inherited from their mother and father would be very, very different. That's what I would predict anyway, although it hasn't been looked at very well.
This is starting to look quite convincing. Just marry someone from a different race, and your kids will be full of beans. If only it were that simple.
I think we have to remember the genes are important, but your lifestyle, generally speaking, for most people, is far, far more so. What will overwhelmingly determine your daughter's chance of getting diabetes is not the fact that you've married into a family that has no history of it, it's what you feed her. And I'm pretty sure, I don't know, that your daughter is well fed, she doesn't eat cheeseburgers every day, she doesn't eat enormous curries and naans every day, and if she stays underweight, she's highly likely to get away without having diabetes, which is not to say that there is no genetic predisposition to diabetes, which varies from place to place. That is true. I mean, people often think that you can separate your medical fate, your intellectual fate, your fate in terms of contentment. It's like a cake. You can slice it into a bit that's called gene, a bit that's called environment. You can't do that. You have to unbake the cake, and you can't unbake a cake.
It is hard to unpick the effects of genes and environment. To do that, what you'd really need is a massive human experiment. Get millions of people of different races to breed with each other for hundreds of years, separate them into radically different environments, and see the effect. Well, it turns out that experiment's already been done. It's called Brazil, and I'm off there on the hunt for mixed race advantage. The genetic makeup of the world is changing. With air travel so easy and relationships forming across the globe, we're all going to be mixed race one day. And if you want to know what that future looks like, take a look at Brazil. I've come here to continue my hunt for the genetics of mixed race advantage.
What you notice here is that everybody looks completely different. In London, you see the odd mixed race person. Here, to see someone who it looks like they belong to any one race in particular, that's the strange thing. You know, in England, you sort of can. You can look at someone and say, I'm probably right in thinking that your ancestors came from Africa, India, China. You can't do that here. It's just so mixed race.
Brazil's history of racial mixing started in the 1550s, when the first of nearly 4 million slaves were transported here. While the southern states of America were preventing breeding between black and white with their anti-miscegenation laws, the colonial bosses of Brazil were actively encouraging it. The Africans and Native Americans were outnumbering the Europeans, and the Portuguese were worried about how black their country was becoming. So they shipped in extra white women from Portugal to breed and whiten the racial mix. Geneticists call this racial mixing admixture, something Dr. Rinaldo Pereira is using to help find disease genes.
One thing that we must have in mind is that the Brazilian population, it's a totally new population. Almost every Brazilian is admixed. So we are talking about 85–90% of admixture.
Is Brazil like a model for the world?
I think that the whole world is turning more admixed, right? What in my sense is good, you know, it's good. I mean.
So we're becoming more like Brazil.
Exactly, because I mean, people is moving around. So in the future, maybe the whole world are admixing.
A census carried out in the 1980s found at least 130 different colloquial terms for skin color in Brazil. And this is just a few of them. An average Brazilian might describe themselves as tan cashew or bleached white. There's caramel, cinnamon, dusky, mocha, and even white with pink highlights.
Can you tell someone's ancestry here in Brazil by looking at their skin color?
No, definitely not. You know, in individual terms, you can use the skin color as a proxy to say, okay, if you have the dark skin, you are African. But when you get the result from genomic ancestry, you have like 60–70% of European ancestry. That's just happened because the number of genes that control skin color are not that much. You know, I mean, probably we are talking about 5–10 genes.
You can't judge race by skin color?
No, definitely not.
¿Cuál color yo tengo?
Morena parda. No, morena parda. Morena
Almost. All this racial mixing looks very nice, a bit like a Rainbow Nation Benetton ad. But there's something I've started to notice. The rich areas seem to be full of white people. And it looks like the darker you are, the poorer you are.
In spite of all this admixture, we also have the strong signs of discrimination and racism. It's incredible how this admixture, that is a biological thing in the sense we've been talking here, does not overcome the social construction we have in our country. So something is going on in our society that we need to fix it.
All this mixture is attracting some of the world's leading geneticists to Brazil. Is there anything in their work that might help in my search for mixed race advantage? This is Dr. Mark Shriver. He discovered one of the major genes for skin color. Never frightened to venture into controversial territory, Dr. Shriver is in downtown Rio today, looking at the genetics of beauty.
Well, this is the 3D camera that we're looking at right here. It works by projecting a series of spots onto a person's face, and then triangulation helps us make all sorts of measurements of the entire surface of the face.
Mark measures each face, then takes a DNA sample. He's comparing the levels of facial symmetry with the genes, looking to see if there's any link between symmetry and being heterozygous. That's when the genes are more varied.
People who are more symmetrical have probably been challenged less by the environment, so they've had better nutrition, they've had fewer infections, they've had less stress in their lives. They probably also have better genes. People who are more symmetrical are indeed more heterozygous.
Although we might not be aware of it, studies show that we all find symmetry very attractive. It may well be that we've evolved to use symmetry as a signal to pick the most heterozygous, fittest mate.
What we're finding is that the process of admixture itself is increasing the symmetry. So these observations are consistent with higher levels of heterozygosity. Indeed, there are reasons to think that what might come of the admixture that created Brazil has and will lead to increased attractiveness, increased symmetry, better health.
So Mark's early results show that the more mixed race you are, the more heterozygous. But as I watch Mark measuring faces, I can't help thinking of those old images of eugenicists at work.
You know, this kind of measuring racial traits, it sounds quite like Victorian science. Have you been criticized for doing this work?
Yeah, in some cases, you know, extensive and continued criticism. Most of that criticism is really quite simple-minded and ill-conceived, part of a superficial political correctness. I kind of resent it sometimes when people look at the kind of work that we're doing and think, well, you know, this isn't important biology. But, you know, what easier and better way to discover how evolution has acted in humans than to study the traits that are obviously different.
Mark's data looks like a major piece of evidence for mixed race advantage. But I remember being told back in London that you can't unbake a cake. Genes are only one of the ingredients that make us who we are. It's our environment that's really crucial. But Brazil has a huge range of social environments, another reason why it's such a useful testing ground. In the rich areas, there are mainly white people. In the tough favelas, it's much more mixed race. Does being mixed race help them cope with this tougher environment? Here, one study is searching for the genes that cause anxiety and depression. Heading up the team, Dr. Jerome Breen.
Brazil will be the second most unequal country on earth after India. India, let's say, has a fairly well-known caste system. Brazil doesn't, but it operates an informal, what I call chromatocracy. You know, basically, the whiter you are, the better you tend to do.
To find out how living here affects these people, the researchers are carrying out a detailed survey that measures precise levels of environmental stress.
Alguma vez você presenciou alguém sofrer uma lesão grave com risco de vida ou ser assassinado?
Sim.
E que tipo de evento foi esse? Com quem foi esse evento?
Foi com um rapaz. Tá no mercado, o outro chegou, tacou álcool nele, jogou fósforo e tacou fogo.
E era assim uma pessoa desconhecida?
Desconhecida.
We could see from the data that the traumas were mostly related to seeing someone being murdered, straight bullets, violence at home, violence on the street. Everything is related to violence.
The team did the same survey in the rich white areas and are now starting to analyze their early results. The gap between rich and poor is so big here that they expected to see far higher levels of mental illness in the stressful mixed race areas. But surprisingly, that wasn't the case at all.
These are results from our preliminary results, and they indicate that basically mixed race people report the same levels of anxiety and depression as non-mixed race people. But we know that mixed race people generally live in poorer neighborhoods, generally experience more violent crime, so mixed race individuals may be more resilient to mental health problems than the non-mixed race people.
So what could possibly explain the unexpected mental health advantage in the favelas?
People with mixed ancestry are likely to have more healthy biological systems to enable them to cope with stress. That we're more likely to have a good functioning copy of at least one of each gene system.
You're more likely to be heterozygous.
More likely to be heterozygous. So it makes sense to me that mixed race individuals would have an advantage in an environment such as this.
I think this is incredible stuff. I mean, if it's true, and it's early days with this research, then it has extraordinary implications. This has been a real experiment that's shown that there really could be a biological advantage to being mixed race, that mixed race people could have more robust mental health.
It's time I got back home, because I've decided to plunge even deeper into the mixed race genome. I'm reaching the final stage of my investigation into whether it's better to be mixed race. It's clear this question hinges on how diverse our DNA is. I found out that restricting diversity, being inbred, is a bad thing. Scientists call that homozygosity, something that's clearly linked to higher disease risk. What's good is to have heterozygosity, to inherit gene copies from each parent that are as different as possible. And there's evidence to suggest that the best way to achieve this diversity is to mix races. So what does this mean for my mixed race daughter, Tara? Is her combination of Indian and English genes making her better off? It's time to do a genetic test of my own. I've taken DNA samples from myself and from Tara's dad, Robin. I want to compare them to the genome of a mixed race person. So I've roped in my friend Andrew. He has a Nigerian mum and a white English dad.
I think I've gained great things from both sides of the culture. I've been able to experience things I don't think other people have been able to. I'm able to see things from a different perspective, I'd say.
This program's called Is It Better to Be Mixed Race? What do you think about that?
I definitely think it is. I definitely would do.
A few weeks ago, I sent our DNA samples off to Dr. Jim Wilson. Looking for signs of inbreeding, Jim has done a deep ancestry scan on the three of us and himself to measure our rates of homozygosity. The less of which you have, the better.
So if we first take you, Robin, I'll present your results and my results together, as we were both 100% European. And we can see here I've totaled up the number of millions of letters of your DNA code that are homozygous. It's these sections of DNA where the DNA from your mother and father is identical. If you total all of mine up, it comes to just over 100 million letters. And Robin's just about the same. He's about 95 million letters. So it seems that we're actually quite homozygous, you and I. And I think this is because we're both European, and Europe isn't such a big gene pool. It's entirely different when we come to look at you, Aarathi, because you've got 60 million letters that are homozygous. And this tells me that you come from a more diverse population than Europe. And then we come to you, Andrew. And when we look at your runs of homozygosity, we see that you essentially have none.
Hardly anything.
you've only got a total of about 2 million letters that are homozygous. Remember, Robin and I have about 100 million. I was so shocked when I saw this, I had to repeat the analysis, because I've never seen anything like it before. And this is partly because you're mixed race, but I think more importantly almost because you're first generation mixed race. It means that your parents don't share any ancestry for a very, very long time. And if we think that people left Africa maybe 70,000 years ago, it's possible that your mother and father don't share any ancestors for all that time.
Right. That's a very long time.
In some way, this is the pinnacle of heterozygosity.
So yeah, I'm really surprised as well. I thought, yeah. But yeah, my parents are completely different in that sense, so yeah.
No long runs, no...
Andrew's results are astonishing. Even more so when compared with the data Jim has gathered from samples all over the world.
So over on this side of the graph, this is in fact an isolated Amazonian tribe that's very, very small, and it's one of the last places on Earth that people got to. So there'll be very, very low diversity, so they're extremely homozygous. Moving down here, Robin and I are here bang in the middle of the big European cluster. Aarathi, actually, you are grouping with the rather diverse end of the South Asian spectrum. And down below, more diverse than the three of us, are the Africans. These are a group from Senegal, and way down here, at the very bottom, with essentially no homozygosity at all, is Andrew, who's the most extreme person we've analysed in over 5,000 people.
You're unique.
I like that. That's a good thing, definitely.
That sounds like it might be a great thing for our daughter, then. Right?
Yes. If we were to analyse her, I would predict that she would be less homozygous than either of you, considerably so, but I'm not sure if she'd be as heterozygous as Andrew, but she'd be nearly there. Should be a good thing.
What you're seeing is potentially has real health impacts.
Potentially. They might be rather small. Yeah. The environment, what we do to ourselves, what we eat, how much exercise we take is very, very important as well. But I believe that this will have an impact. The question is how much impact.
Is it better to be mixed race?
Yes, I think it must be better to be mixed race, particularly for first generation mixtures.
Okay, so first generation mix Andrew is just one person. I know that's not a proper sample size, but it does all look very convincing. Perhaps it's time I got a reality check. Back to Professor Bill Amos from Cambridge, who started my journey off in the first place. So Bill, I've learned that there are genetic differences between races, that if you are mixed race, your DNA is more likely to be heterozygous, and that might lead to possible benefits in physical health and mental health, and it also might make you more attractive. And that's quite exciting to know, isn't it?
I think it's really exciting. I mean, I think at the moment we're just starting out on starting to understand some of these aspects. My own personal feeling is that these effects are there, and they're there to be discovered, but I think to jump the gun and leap in and say immediately that if you have two very different parents that you're guaranteed to be some kind of superhuman is way off the mark. I think what we've seen is that in general there are subtle benefits to be generated, and that at the top end we find some extraordinarily talented, beautiful, athletically adept people. But this isn't to say that you're guaranteed to produce an Olympic athlete or a Nobel laureate simply by marrying somebody who looks very different from yourself. We mustn't ignore the fact that the environment's there, that there's the rest of our genome to consider.
This is all preliminary research, and we don't have any firm conclusions yet. But what I really like, and I really like the fact that I've found that the research is going on, and research in a field that many people call taboo, that both scientists and the public think of as controversial.
Yes, personally I'm slightly shocked by how controversial some people find it. I think it's fantastically important to keep this kind of research going, because with these kinds of findings, we could open up a lot of particularly medical benefits, I see, unproven as yet, but certainly I think this is a really important area to research.
In the last 50 years, we British have been slowly coming around to the idea racial mixing is okay.
Something new and ugly raises its head in Britain: racial violence.
In the late 50s, most people seemed to be against the idea. But only 5 years later, we blazed a trail by broadcasting the first ever interracial kiss in world television history.
I want to kiss you. What for? Just because. Oh, that's better.
By the early 1980s, it seemed the jury was still out. Pop group Madness released Embarrassment, a song commenting on society's racist attitudes to a white girl made pregnant by a black man. Whilst interracial marriage was harmless, saucy fun in this sitcom.
Just make sure you don't put the whites in with the colours.
Oh, personally I find putting the whites in with the colours goes very well.
By the year 2000, it was revealed that Britain had the highest rate of interracial couples than anywhere else in the world. Today, mixed-race people are more visible than ever, and to me, my daughter Tara represents all the cultural benefits that brings. She loves learning a dance from my mother's hometown deep in the south of India, but she also learns the piano with her English grandmother, a concert pianist. So it's important to realize being mixed race doesn't have to dilute culture. And as I've discovered, it might just dilute disease.
What I've found out is that the old ideas of racial purity equaling biological superiority is absolute nonsense. Diversity is always better. I've always felt that culturally, but now I found out that it just might be true genetically as well.
Explore the themes raised by this or any of the programmes featured in the Race Science's last Taboo season. Visit channel4.com/race and science. Season continues tomorrow night from 10 with Bleach, Nip Tuck, The White Beauty Myth, explores westernisation surgery. Next tonight, the real story of the Great Escape and the dark mission of detection and revenge that followed.